Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome to our fourth out of the 5 workshops that we have running this week for our RETHINK annual campaign. My name is Shannon McGowan and I'm the RETHINK Programme Executive at Business in the Community in Northern Ireland. So just before we get started on the bereavement workshop, I just want to briefly talk about RETHINK and what RETHINK is. So it's an initiative that was created in April 2020. It's National Lottery funded, and the partners are ARC Healthy Living Centre in Irvinstown, Bogside and Brandywell Health Forum in Derry, and Business in the Community in Northern Ireland. So some of you may have seen some of our billboards up in the northwest area. You might have heard some of the radio adverts, or maybe you've actually attended a RETHINK workshop before. And if you have, that's brilliant. If you haven't, we have so much coming up over the next 2 years. Our main aim for RETHINK is to increase resilience within individuals. So it's all around building resilience and well-being within ourselves. So please keep an eye out on either the Business in the Community #RETHINK website, or my colleague Mary Breslin is also on this morning from Bogside and Brandywell. So if you keep an eye out on the 2 websites, you'll see all the workshops coming up that you can come to free of charge and for everybody. Just to also let you know that we have an opportunity for a seasonal affective disorder webinar tomorrow from 2 to 3, and the lovely Caroline is also facilitating that. So if that interests you, visit one of the websites and we can get you signed up for that as well. If you've any questions or concerns around RETHINK or the bereavement workshop, just pop them into the chat box and I'll be able to get back to you. But without further ado, I would love to introduce you then to Dr. Carline Burrow, our clinical psychologist from Northern Meadow Therapy. So I'll just pass you over now to Caroline and she'll take it from there.
Thank you, Shannon. Hello, everyone. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about bereavement and grief and your experiences within that. So obviously it's a very evocative subject, and I'm just inviting you to take care of yourselves today. So if you know that you're currently struggling with bereavement and grief, or you know that it's going to be a bit of a trigger to you, just look after yourself. So if you need to take a break, do that. As Shannon said, if you have any questions, just pop them into the chat box, and I'm quite happy to answer questions as we go along. I'm conscious that I've got a lot to talk about today, so we may go through some of the slides pretty quickly because I really wanted you to have all this information, but the slides will be available after the webinar, so you can have a look at those later. So if we do skip through any slides a bit quickly, that information's all there for you that you can access later via Shannon and the team here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about, as I said, grief and bereavement and what our normal reactions are to these. We're going to briefly talk about a couple of models of grief. Now, I don't want to go too far into the kind of academic study of grief and bereavement, but I think the 2 models that I'm going to share are quite helpful in us being able to understand our experience and quite helpful in helping us cope. I'll run through some kind of tips of coping with bereavement for yourself when you experience bereavement, but also in how we might support others, and then briefly talk a little bit about bereavement and COVID at the moment, and then we'll finish off with just thinking about when you might need a little bit of extra help, and there's a list of sources of support there that again can be shared afterwards. So what do we mean by bereavement and grief? So most of us will have experienced some kind of bereavement within our lives. So when we're bereaved, we're deprived of something or someone, and the importance is that it's something or someone that is very dear to us, that is loved by us, or that has some significant meaning to us. So that's what a bereavement is, the loss of something that had meaning to us. So that might be a loved one, it might be a pet, it might be a job, it might be a house, it could be anything. Today we're focusing on the loss of humans, of human loved ones, but we do briefly touch about animal loss, and also that we can have bereavements to a variety of losses, not just the loss of a human. So grief is what we feel. Grief is the distress that we feel that's caused by this loss. And as we'll talk about, we experience grief in many, many different ways. So we experience grief emotionally. We experience a whole host of emotions, including sadness, anxiety, anger. We might feel a numbness or not really feel any emotion. We also experience grief physically. So it's not uncommon for people to feel nauseous or sick, to have changes to their sleep patterns, or to experience things like muscle pain or exhaustion. We experience grief cognitively in that it might affect our cognitive abilities, so we might have difficulty concentrating or remembering things, but it also affects the way we think, so we might have intrusive thoughts or images coming into our mind, or we may become preoccupied with topics around death or dying. Grief also grief also affects us behaviourally. So our behaviours change when we're grieving. We might not look after ourselves in the way that we used to do. We might not have a shower or get dressed. We might find that we've got a lack of motivation to do things, or we might find that we're looking at different ways of coping that aren't that helpful, like the increased use of alcohol. And these are all normal reactions to grief. But as you can see, grief affects us in many different ways. Socially, when we've experienced a bereavement, we might have also then experienced a change in our living circumstances. We may have become more isolated because of that, or we may feel more isolated because we're not connecting with people in the same way because of our grief. A bereavement may also cause change in finances. So as you can see, it's not just emotional, physical, cognitive and behavioural effects. It's a wider effect of our social world is affected when we're bereaved. And spiritually, grief affects us. So whether we have a religion or not, whether we have a faith or not, it may lead to us experiencing a question of our beliefs about the world and leading to kind of existential questions that we may struggle with. So as you can see, grief affects us in such a huge way, really encompassing all areas of our life. Now, this slide is really busy and overwhelming, and that's intentional because these are just some of the normal reactions that we experience when we're grieving and when we've been bereaved. And as you can see, there's loads there. You know, we talk about lack of self-care, so behavioural effect. We've got anxiety on there, that emotional effect. We've got overeating on there, which is, you know, again, a behavioural effect, or feeling frozen, feeling like we can't move. So what I really want to get across to you is there are many, many normal reactions to grief, and whatever we're feeling in terms of emotional feelings or physical feelings or how our thoughts are being processed, this is all a normal reaction to this huge event of a bereavement, and it's part of grief, it's part of that distress. So when we think about grief, we can think about grief in two different phases. So we can think about acute grief, which is that raw initial phase that happens shortly after our loss. Now, sometimes we may experience this acute grief before somebody dies. So particularly if they're living with a terminal illness, we can start experiencing that acute grief, that acute distress. As we've talked about already, this is made up of multiple emotions. So people can experience all sorts of different emotions when they're grieving. We often have an urge to be reconnected with our loved ones. So there's often a preoccupation of them in our thoughts. We may have extreme physical reactions. So people may not be able to get out of bed because they're just so weak or fatigued or just being bowled over by the grief. We may experience feelings of disbelief or derealization. So we're feeling that things aren't real. So things don't feel real to us. We don't believe the loss. We are questioning the reality of the situation. And this is a very normal reaction when we've been bereaved of somebody. And this acute phase, this very raw phase of grief, can re-emerge at other times. So particularly at times of anniversaries, at certain times of the year, birthdays, for example. But it can also be triggered by memories. Also, for example, hearing a song on the radio that meant something to you and the person, then that can trigger this acute raw phase again. We also have integrated grief, which is a kind of phase where our life is moving forward a little bit. It's continuing to move, but we continue with this enduring grief. So it's the grief where we can engage a little bit more in everyday life. We're not in that raw, painful stage, but we still have that pain. You know, we're still grieving, we're still struggling, but we can kind of re-engage a little bit in some way. And this is where the meaning of the loss has become more integrated in our life. So we've made a little bit more sense of it. And often we continue our connection to our loved ones. So we continue our bonds, but we can still engage in life. So we might be able to get up and go to work, but we might be talking to our loved one that we've lost. And again, this is all very normal. And there's no time scale on this particularly. You know, there's no kind of, well, you're in acute grief for this amount of time and then you move into integrated grief. There's no time scale. And if we look at, we're going to look at a model in a little while, and that really talks about how we often kind of oscillate between those two places of being in that raw space and then being in that space where we can engage in life in some other way. So some of the common emotional experiences we have when we're grieving is shock. So often we can't believe what's happening, or we might not feel anything initially. We might be questioning why this has happened, and we might feel quite disorientated. Obviously, a common emotional experience is that emotional pain that we might feel. We also may feel physical pain as well. So it's not uncommon to get acute physical pain when we're faced with a loss. And this pain can feel so overwhelming and frightening, and it might be something that you've never experienced emotional pain like this before. And as we move from kind of acute grief to more integrated grief, that pain does lessen, but the pain is still there. And as we said, sometimes it can come back really quickly, acutely. Even years later, we can just feel this really intense pain about our loss. We may feel anger, so it's common to feel anger when we're grieving. We may feel anger at our loved one for leaving us. We may feel anger at ourselves, at others. If we have a faith or a belief, we may feel anger at God, at the world, etc. So it's not uncommon to feel angry. Another common emotional experience is guilt. So often we think about the if onlys. What could I have done differently? Could I have prevented this? If only I'd done that. And we might think about all the things that we wanted to say or do and that we didn't, and have some regrets about that. Or some of the things we said or did that we didn't want to do and have regrets about that. So again, guilt is not an uncommon reaction. We may feel depressed. So often when we're bereaved of somebody, it questions our beliefs, and so life can often feel like it has no meaning anymore. We're overwhelmed by all these emotions, and actually we begin to shut down and feel depressed. So again, that's not uncommon, and it's quite common for people to feel like there's nothing worth living for, or to have suicidal thoughts. And obviously that's something that's helpful to get extra help with, but it's not an uncommon experience. Loneliness and isolation, again, is a common emotional experience. So even if we've maybe lost somebody in the context of a family or friendships, the emotional pain that we feel is very personal. So even if other people around us are grieving for that person, we still might feel quite isolated because our relationship is an individual one. So we might feel lonely within our pain or distress. Socially, often when we're bereaved, our relationships might have changed because of that bereavement, or we might find that we're not engaging in the social relationships that we normally do, either for a short period of time or a longer period of time. So for example, we might have some time off work, so we're not seeing people that we normally see. So this can lead to feeling very lonely and isolated. We also find that in society, people often avoid talking about death and bereavement, and they often worry that we're going to upset somebody if we start talking about it. So often it's kind of the elephant in the room that people don't talk about the bereavements, and so that again can make us feel very lonely and isolated. And as we'll talk about later in terms of supporting people it's often useful not to avoid talking about the bereavement and the loss. It's useful to bring these things into the conversation. And I think that our society doesn't always acknowledge grief and the depth of grief that we feel. So there's often an expectation that within a couple of weeks, you're back to normal, you're back to work, you're back to all your own responsibilities. And really, grief doesn't work like that. Grief is a long-term thing. We feel it for a long time. And as we saw from the initial slides, it encompasses every area of our life. It's huge. And yet we kind of expected, well, 2 weeks you're back at work and everything's fine. So I think we need to acknowledge that often we feel lonely and isolated in our grief because society doesn't always support us in the way that it should. It's common to feel that sense of longing for somebody, so that real sense of wanting them still to be there. And it's common for people to have an experience of hearing or seeing the deceased person. So there's lots of theories around this about how we're kind of helping ourselves to transition, how we're coping with that. Obviously, we might have religious beliefs around this, but it's not uncommon to have these experiences. So this is the dual process model of coping with bereavement. And this really talks about the kind of experience that we have in every day when we've been bereaved. And it says that we basically have two kind of orientated ways of being. One is the loss orientated way of being. So this is where we're in that real acute state of grief, that acute pain. Grief has taken over our life, and that's really where we're at. That's all we can focus on. So at that point in time, we're trying to make sense of that person leaving us, of dying, and how do we live without them, and we're focusing on that loss. And we may be in denial of that loss. We may try and avoid that loss, and so we kind of try and avoid engaging in everyday life and doing new things. And that's perfectly normal and fine. We need to do that. We need to feel that pain. So that's the kind of loss orientated side of things. The restoration orientated side of things when we're grieving is that we have to attend to all the things that have happened in our life as a result of the bereavement. So we may need to do some really practical things like organise a funeral, or change bank statements, or sort out childcare responsibilities. So we have to do these other things. And so when we're in this acute stage where we literally maybe can't even get out of bed, there's these other things that we still have to do. So we have to kind of bounce from one to another. And over time, we might start doing new things, or we might feel like we need a distraction from grief. So even in that very acute early stage in grief, we might just stick on the TV and watch a comedy and be laughing out loud. And our loved one maybe died a few days ago, but it's okay that we can kind of have both of these ways of being, because we can't always stay in that acute raw stage all the time. So we kind of bounce in everyday life from one to another. So from being very loss orientated to be restoration orientated. And this is really normal. So people often feel guilty, for example, if they laugh. So if they're sharing a joke with somebody not long after somebody's died, they might feel guilty about that, but that's okay. This is how life is, that we hold both of these things in our lives when we lose somebody. And over time, we might be more in the restoration orientated side of things. So we start developing new roles or new identities and relationships. So as I say, the reason why I've shared this model is just to understand that it's okay to be in both of these sides of things. That, it's okay to be in this raw part of pain of grief, but it's also okay to distract yourself from grief as well, and that it's really normal that we bounce from one to another. So this model about grief is really thinking about how things change over time when we grieve. So when the circle there represents at the top there represents what our life is before the loss. So everything in the blue circle is our life. And then when we experience the loss, as we've talked about, because it's so all-encompassing, it feels like just that's taken up our whole life, especially initially. And we just feel completely overwhelmed by the loss of that person that we loved. And then our expectation is often that over time, that loss will get smaller and smaller. But actually, in reality, what people find is that our grief is there. Our grief stays there. We don't stop missing that person, but that our life expands around it. So some people find this a really helpful model to think about how we can still hold our grief and we can still have a continuing bond with that person, but our life begins to expand a little bit, and that's okay. So the drawing there with the leaves and shoots coming out is actually done by a colleague of mine to kind of represent this growth after grief. And as you can see on the first black circle, there's like one little leaf coming out, and that might be that one day you decided to take a shower. So you've been really struggling, you haven't been able to do anything, but one day you took a shower. And when you had that shower, you didn't think about the loss, you didn't think about the death of your loved one. So it's a tiny bit of growth. And then over time, maybe you went for a coffee with your friend, or maybe you listened to something on the radio. And then over time, life changes, you build new relationships, you might start doing new things, so that life grows around the grief. And as I say, sometimes people find that a really useful model to think about. Oh, it's okay to kind of move out of the grief a little bit, that you can build a life around that. Do put any questions. If you've got any questions, do stick them in chat. I'm aware that I'm going quite quickly, so if you want me to slow down and you want to go through any of these in a bit more detail, do just stick that in chat. So we're going to briefly talk about prolonged grief, or it's sometimes called complicated or complex grief. And this is where that kind of acute grief, that real raw, not being able to engage in life, not accepting the reality of the loss, where that kind of lasts a little bit longer than we would expect. So as I said, there's no right or wrong way to grieve, and there's no real time scale. But if for about a year after the bereavement, you're still really, really struggling to engage in life in a meaningful way, and that grief is really raw still, then there's maybe an indication that this is prolonged or complicated grief. And this can last for many years. And there's risk factors for prolonged grief. So there's reasons maybe why we might develop it. So not being able to say goodbye in the way that we wanted to, in being very isolated if we experience the death of a child, because we have an expectation that we're not going to survive our children, they will survive us. So that's a particularly difficult death. If we lose someone that we're very, very close or dependent to, or if we experience some kind of unexpected or traumatic death, we can see why this would be really difficult to process and to cope with. So we're more likely to develop prolonged or complicated grief. And similarly, if we're struggling with other things, so if we already have mental health issues, if we've already experienced past extreme stresses or traumas, or we're having current stresses or traumas going on in our life, it may be that the grief is just too much to bear, that it becomes much harder for us to cope with it. So this is when we would be looking really to seek help. So signs of prolonged grief would be a real preoccupation with your loved one's death, very, very intense emotions, those intense emotions that we talked about, that the intensity isn't going away and they're there all the time. So it's normal to experience these intense emotions in grief, but if they're not really reducing in intensity over time, they're always there, then it's maybe a bit of a red flag. Similarly, that kind of sense of numbness or detachment where we're just not feeling anything at all for an extended period of time, or that we're feeling that life has no meaning or purpose, or that it's not worth living, or feeling that we wish that we'd also died with that person. So if we're really struggling to enjoy any aspects of life or carry out normal routines kind of a year after a bereavement, having difficulty remembering positive experiences with our loved one, then it may be that you're experiencing prolonged or complicated grief. So it's really helpful then to seek some help from the GP or from a bereavement support organisation. And as I say, at the end of the slideshow, there is some links to support organisations. So some tips for coping with grief. I'm not going to read all of this out because it's there for you. You can access the slides afterwards. But essentially, we need to try and accept our reactions. So it's okay to feel what we're feeling. You know, all of these emotional, physical, cognitive, behavioural, spiritual impacts of grief are all normal. So being kind to yourself, being compassionate to yourself, being gentle to yourself is really helpful. Remembering that we all grieve in different ways. There's no right or wrong way to grieve, and allow yourself to grieve in a way that suits you. It's helpful to learn about grief, to understand a little bit about what you might be experiencing, and also to seek and accept support. So that might be professional support, or it might be just friends and relatives. It's helpful often to talk about the person who died, your emotions, to share your memories, but also get practical help if you need it. So if you're struggling to manage day-to-day activities, get some help. Expressing your grief. It's really important that we find ways to express our grief. So that might be crying, it might be shouting or screaming or talking about your emotions. It might also be finding creative ways to express your feelings through music, art, poetry, journaling. And you can also talk and write to your deceased loved ones. So continue some of those conversations, you know, write them a letter, have a chat with them, because that helps that continuing bond.
Caroline,
Yeah.
sorry, Caroline, there's just a question here. If you have lost someone within 2 to 3 weeks, is that too early to seek professional help?
No, I think if you're struggling, if you're finding it hard, it doesn't matter when that time is. If you feel like you need support, go and get some help. So I think what you're experiencing is that really raw stage. But if that's hard to cope with, go and get some help. And there's lots of really great organisations around. So crews are really good, and there's a whole list at the end of this. But yeah, definitely, if you're struggling, there's no time scale. Okay. Any other questions, Shannon?
None yet, Caroline. Thank you for that response.
Okay. So definitely connect to others as well. So sometimes it's difficult in grief if no one around you has experienced something similar. So if you can connect to others who've experienced a loss similar to yours, that's often helpful. So it might be a peer group, it might be looking at support groups or checking out books or internet resources. Making sure that you can try and look after yourself. Now, that's often really hard, particularly in the early stages of grief when you're really struggling, you know, because you don't want to get up and make food and you might be having trouble sleeping. But if you can try and eat regularly, try and get in a good sleep routine. And if you're struggling, maybe try and ask someone to help. Can someone just cook your meals for you or help you get the shopping in? Pacing yourself's really important. So grief is exhausting. Do you know, it takes it out of us. So allow yourself time to rest. Don't commit to too much at that time, and just allow extra time for everyday activities. When you feel able to, get involved in things as well. So part of, you know, growing those little tendrils outside of the grief is maybe trying new things. And often people find that it's useful to maybe do something that they didn't do with their loved one, so that it's something different. And do things that you enjoy as well. So it's okay to have fun. It's okay to spend time doing things that you enjoy, watching a funny film, being with people who make you laugh. Sometimes people feel guilty that they're alive, basically, and they're enjoying life when they've lost someone precious to them, particularly often if it's been a traumatic or unexpected death. But it's okay, it's all right that you are allowed to have fun, you're still allowed to laugh when you're grieving. So we can hold both. Find ways of remembering your loved one. So talk about them, make an album, keep some special objects of theirs, do something to commemorate them. Try not to make any major life decisions until you feel ready to. Now, often when we're bereaved, it might mean that there's a huge change in our life and we have to make decisions like selling a house or moving, or financial decisions, but try and give yourself a little bit of space if you can before you do that. Reconnect to your beliefs. So if you found that your beliefs have been questioned, if you're struggling with your beliefs, find a way to reconnect with them. And just remember that those intense raw feelings don't last forever. And as we said, seek some professional help if you need it. So I'm not going to go through these because I'm just conscious of the time, but there's some little tips there about some of the thoughts that we might have when we're grieving and how we might respond to them. And I think maybe you guys have done some CBT before. Some of you maybe done some cognitive behavioral therapy work before, so you'll recognize some of this. But often when we're responding to thoughts, difficult thoughts when we're grieving, critical thoughts of ourselves, the response is often about self-compassion. So just allowing ourselves to feel the way that we feel, reminding ourselves, what would we say to a friend if they were feeling like this? Are we being as compassionate as we would be to a friend? So just showing ourselves some kindness. So we're just going to talk a little bit about supporting others when they've been bereaved. So often people find this quite difficult because we don't want to make things worse and we want to be kind and compassionate, but we worry that if we talk about the person who's died, that will upset people. We will, because they'll probably have an emotional reaction to that, but that's okay. So the most important thing is listening with empathy. So we're going to see a short video in a minute about what we mean by empathy. Give them time and space to grieve in their way. So as we said, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. People all grieve in their own way, and people may need more time than you think. Encourage them to talk about the person who's died if they want to. Offer specific practical help. So often when we offer help, we do that, oh, well, give us a ring if you need anything. And often people who are struggling aren't able to give you that ring and ask. So, can I get the shopping for you? Can I pick the kids up from school? Can I come and clean your house for you? Can I just look after the kids for a couple of hours while you get some kip? It's offer very specific practical help. Check in on them regularly. So send an email, send a text, phone. When we can, visit people again, call in, just making sure that you're regularly checking in. And again, it might be about checking in them in potentially difficult times. So a year down the line or 2 years down the line, thinking about, well, anniversaries, birthdays, Christmas, other religious holidays, that's going to be the times when people are more likely to be in that kind of acute raw stage again. So it's a good time to check in then. Remembering that people might not always want to talk, but just being there with somebody is really helpful. So, just going for a coffee and talking about something else, or just sitting and watching a film with somebody, that's really supportive. You don't have to have a big in-depth conversation if that's not helpful for them. But essentially, don't avoid people who've been bereaved. People often feel isolated and often withdraw. So when we avoid them, it kind of feeds into that isolation. And being available in the short term is great. And often when we've been bereaved, we have a lot of help in the short term. We have a lot of support, but in the longer term, that support drops off. So it's remembering that. So, 3 months down the line, just checking in how they're doing. Try and avoid, well, just don't, not even try and avoid, don't use cliches. So things like you'll get over it, really unhelpful. We all do it because often we don't know what to say and these words just tumble out of our mouths before we realize what we're saying. Sometimes just listening helps. And as we see from the video, there aren't any right words you can really say anywhere. So just being there. And similarly, don't tell someone it's time to move on. They will re-engage in life when they're ready. And if they're struggling, they can get some extra support, but it's not up to us to be telling them when they should be moving on. Drop off gifts, a meal, things like that. Just you're letting people know that you're there, thinking of them. And particularly in these days when we can't get together in the way that we want to get together with people, sending a card or a letter, it's a real personal touch that again just lets somebody know that you're holding them in mind, that you're thinking of them. So can we have the video played, please? We're just going to watch a little bit of a video on empathy. Thank you. So as we can see from the video, that often we are trying to make something better, and so we often respond in a way that isn't very helpful. And this is the thing about bereavement: you can't make it better when you're supporting somebody, but you can sit with their distress, and actually that's all they need. So just freeing ourselves up from that idea that we have to fix it for them actually makes us more available to connect with that person, so that we can really give them some heartfelt support, and that's what's going to help them. So I've got a few slides here about supporting children and young adults. I'm just going to have a look at how we're doing for time. So yeah, we should be okay. So just like adults, children and young people react to bereavement in a variety of different ways. And again, there's no right or wrong way for a child or a young person to react. It's going to be affected by how old they are, what their understanding is of death, and also by the relationship with the person who has died. Children often move in and out of grief more so than adults do, so it's not unusual to see a child being very distressed and then kind of playing with their toys and looking fine. And just like adults, their behaviours related to their grief will stop over time. Their kind of acute reaction will stop over time. But again, if you're worried, contact your GP or a grief support organisation. And for example, Cruise have got a really good support network for young people and children as well. Obviously, if your child or young adult is harming themselves or has suicidal thoughts, then seek some urgent help. Again, this is not unusual, but it might be that they just need some extra help with that. Children might experience some of the following types of behaviours or emotions, so it's not unusual for them to become more withdrawn or more quiet than usual. Anxiety or clinginess is quite common. And just like adults, feeling hopelessness, sadness, despair, mood swings, children can quite often begin to blame themselves for the death of somebody, and often that can be due to their cognitive abilities and their kind of understanding of death. And children, depending on their age, have quite an egocentric view of the world, so it may be that they blame themselves because they don't really understand what happened. So it's important to kind of give them a chance to talk about that and reassure them that that's not the case. It's not unusual for them to experience disturbed sleep or nightmares, and they may regress in their behaviour, so they may start bedwetting or thumb sucking, behaving younger than they normally would. And similarly, anger and aggression can be very common. And also kind of rule breaking behaviour is a way of kind of acting out those emotions. But also you may find that some children become very, very good. And that can often be because they're trying in some way of bringing that person back. So if I'm really good, maybe that person might come back. So again, these are all normal but distressing reactions to grief that children may have. So in supporting children and young adults, basically making sure that you're looking after yourself. If you feel overwhelmed, if you're experiencing grief at the same time, ask a trusted friend or relation that your child knows well and trusts to talk to them or to look after them for a while. So they might come over for an hour or so and just spend time with your children, like I say, while you have a rest. Trying to speak as openly, as honestly as you can about a death, so about a bereavement, telling them as much as you can that's appropriate for their age and understanding. We often try and protect children by not telling them everything, and sometimes that makes things worse because their imagination is often worse than what we could tell them anyway. Try and avoid using euphemisms like gone to sleep or gone away, because that doesn't make sense to a child. If you go to sleep, well, you wake up again. If you've gone away, you might come back. So it's explaining what the words death and died mean. And for some children, you might have to explain a number of times what that means, that when somebody dies, they don't come back, because they might take a little while before they understand that. And normalizing that we all die, that it's a normal part of life. Some people die at different ages and in different circumstances. And to kind of help their anxiety, we say, most people do live for a long time, but, sometimes people die in different ways. If it's helpful for you and your child, you can talk about your beliefs about what happens after death. And as I say, just remembering that often the child's own imagination is more frightening than what you can tell them. So just thinking about what they can understand for their age, but try and be as open, as honest as you can be. So as we said, younger children might find it harder to understand. Children sometimes worry it was something that they did. So it's just allowing them time to talk about this. Again, if you're struggling to have these conversations with the children, getting somebody else to help you with that, either a friend, somebody that your child knows and trusts, or maybe getting some professional help as well. We don't need to hide our emotions from children. You know, it's normal to cry when we're grieving, for example. You know, so what we're doing is we're teaching children what a normal emotion looks like and how we manage it. So if we're sad and we're crying, we're sad. We're sad because Uncle Bobby died, and this is how I express my sadness. You know, it's okay to cry. If we're angry, maybe explain to them why you're angry so that they don't think that you're angry with them. But again, it's normalizing these emotions so that they understand this is the normal part of grief. Helping them to understand what's going to happen next, and to for them to decide whether or not they want to be involved. So that might be in terms of seeing the body or attending a funeral. And also helping them to be involved in any way that they want. So thinking about how they might want to say goodbye, either in a formal ceremony, if that's what's happening, or they may wish to gather memories or find ways of remembering the person themselves in a more personal way. So encouraging the child or young person to talking about the person who died if they want to, and again, just reassuring them that it's okay to have all these sorts of emotions and it's okay to express them. If you can, trying to maintain some kind of normal routines, but obviously a bit of flexibility, and again, encouraging them to stay connected with their peers, because there's actually a lot of support there for them there. So obviously at the moment we're living in particularly difficult times with the global pandemic. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about bereavement during this time. So obviously living within the restrictions and living with a pandemic, with a virus around, is going to impact on how we would experience grief. So it may be that we are experiencing reduced social interaction, increased isolation at the moment because of everything that's going on. It's likely that there's going to be a reduction of our normal coping mechanisms, because already our everyday routines or our connection with others, work or sport, etc., has been changed. So those normal coping mechanisms maybe aren't there for us in the same way they were. It's potential that we might have reduced access to professional support during this time, either for bereavement or for other mental health issues or for other physical health issues. So it may be that we're already struggling a little bit. And just living in a global pandemic, with the anxieties of that, with the changes to our lifestyles, that's going to already be having an impact on our mental health and well-being. And we're also likely to have other stresses going on at the moment as well as a result of that. So we're kind of in a place where we're maybe a bit delicate anyway. So then if we're then bereaved during this time, we're going to find it harder. And because of the nature of COVID-19 and everything that's going on at the moment, there is a potential that we're more likely to develop complicated or prolonged grief. It may be that if we've been bereaved during this time, that we weren't able to say goodbye in the way that we wanted to, or we weren't able to care for our loved ones while they were dying in the way that we wanted to. We may not have been able to have a funeral in the normal way, or a wake or a memorial, that didn't happen in the way that we wanted to. As we said, we're potentially more isolated from others, and it's potential that we're more likely to experience a traumatic death. So it's just being aware that during these times, ourselves or other people are more likely to develop complicated or prolonged grief. So how might we cope with grief during the time of COVID? So all of the tips that we've already talked about, whatever you can do, use them. So use those. Plan something for the future when we can gather again. So if you haven't been able to have a wake or a ceremony, the funeral that you wanted, a memorial service, plan it for the future. So you know, we might be thinking about a year's time, we might be thinking about doing it on an anniversary, but it's important that if that doesn't feel complete, if you didn't feel like that happened, that that's something that you can plan for. You can find other ways of saying goodbye yourself, so personal ways of saying goodbye, so lighting a candle. So this might be if you can't attend a funeral, for example, at that time when that's going on, maybe light a candle, do your own ceremony, write a letter. You can create memorials online, so that might be a gathering through social media platforms, or it might be that you want to create some kind of memorial page and share memories, share photographs together. Creating a memorial space in your house or garden, so you could plant a tree or create a little space in the house where you might have a picture of your loved one, so that you've got that space where you can feel like you can go and be with them. And just staying in touch with others, so making sure that we're keeping those connections. So even though it can be really hard, if you're getting emails or texts from other people, try and stay in touch and message them. And similarly, if you're looking out for other people, try and stay in touch with them. And actually plan times to connect with others, to talk about your grief or their grief and their loved ones. So, plan a coffee morning online where you're going to have that connection and talk. Remembering to take one day at a time. So this is all the time when we're dealing with grief. Be kind to yourself. That this is particularly difficult times, and it's not unusual to be struggling. Do ask for help if you need it. Hug who you can. So we're really starved of hugs at the moment. But the people that you can hug them. Hug a pet, hug a teddy, but have that connection. If news and social media are things that you find unhelpful, limit the time that you spend on those. And as we said, you can try and share stories and memories about loved ones in other ways. So you might want to write down stories or memories to share, or share photographs. Remembering to try and look after yourself, all the normal things of eating regularly, trying to get some exercise, trying to have some sort of routine, and also spending some time outdoors and in nature can help just with that resilience of coping with grief at this very difficult time. How are we doing for time? Really, really briefly, I just want to mention the loss of an animal companion. So often our relationships with animals can be as deep as they are with humans, and particularly at the time of the global pandemic, when we might have reduced contact with other humans in the same way that we used to do, our animal companions we can feel even closer to them. So when we think about the loss of an animal companion, that can be just the same as losing another human being. So in terms of looking after yourself, it's the same thing. It's the same tips for grief. Don't let anyone tell you how to feel. So you feel the way that you feel when you lose an animal, and that's real grief. You may need to accept that some people won't get that. So some of you listening might not get that, might not understand that. Some of you listening might really get that, and that's okay. But if you've lost an animal companion and you're feeling it, be compassionate with yourself. It's the same grief. So connect to others who've also lost pets, or people who do understand how you feel. Get support from them. And again, you might want to create some kind of ritual or memorial. If you have got other animals, try and keep to a normal routine, and just wait till you're emotionally ready before you think about any new animal companions. And again, seek professional support if you need it. The bereavement services will also work with loss of animal companion, but there's also organisations that specifically look at that. So I know that the Blue Cross have a bereavement service for loss of animals. And also thinking about how you might support other people who've lost an animal companion. So exactly the same as you would with any other bereavement, but just maybe again at this time, particularly when we're more socially isolated, being aware of people who live alone or older adults who have lost an animal companion recently, who may need that little bit of extra support. So other forms of loss that we may be experiencing can also have those grief reactions. So that includes marriage breakdown, redundancy, retirement, change of roles, change of lifestyle. So all of these things can create huge grief reactions as well. So when to seek professional help? So if you're struggling, like I said before, there's no time scale. If you're struggling now, even if it's been quite soon after the death of your loved one, get some support if you need it. If you think you're experiencing prolonged or complicated grief, if you find that you're neglecting yourself or your family, if you're coping with lots of other stresses and it's just too much, if you're experiencing other mental health difficulties or physical conditions are getting worse, if you're experiencing persistent suicidal thoughts, or if you're worried about another member of your family, do go and seek professional help. So you can contact your GP, or you can contact local or national grief support organisations. So there's a whole load of them on here that I've put up for you that you can access after the end of the webinar. Okay, so are there any other questions before we finish off?
Hi, Caroline. There doesn't seem to be any coming through at the minute, but if anybody has any questions, please feel free to pop it into the chat box. I think that was such a lovely webinar, Caroline, something that we don't talk about often enough.
Yeah, definitely. I think we often avoid the subject of death and dying and bereavement, and that just adds to people's isolation. So it's something that I know that I'm very passionate about, is talking more and more about death and what it's like to experience that loss. So there are lots of support out there if people need it, do reach out for it, and also, look out for each other as well and talk to each other about it.
The thing that really stood out for me was Linda Harris's drawing with the leaves. Absolutely lovely, gorgeous, really nice. People are just asking for the slides, so yeah, I will send out the PowerPoint just after this webinar, because there's loads of information on them, Caroline. Absolutely brilliant, lots. And just, I know you mentioned that some people may have done the CBT techniques. It's a different group at the minute that we have on.
Okay, sorry.
No, you're grand, because if people do want to sign up for the 6-week resilience program, do visit either the Bogside and Brandywell or Business in the Community's website, because we can offer that program as well, and you can get involved with the CBT techniques. Just a few thank yous there. It's great to hear that we can do so much to support someone dealing with grief. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we often get afraid that we can't fix it for them, and the reality is that even though we can't fix it, we can just sit with them, and that's really what people need, is just somebody being there for them. You're not going to make it better, but by being there, you help support them.
Yeah. I don't see any more questions coming in, and I just noticed there that it's 3 o'clock. So thank you so much, Caroline. That was absolutely wonderful. Really, really good session.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you all for watching.
If anyone does, if they're interested, Caroline is back on tomorrow, as I said at the start, from 2 to 3 for the seasonal affective disorder webinar, and you can email me directly if you want to register at shannon.mcguyan@batc.org.uk, or, as I say, visit either the Bogside and Brandywell or Business in the Community website to register. But thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you everybody for joining us.